So now here we go. We get started on the theoretical work on anthropology and ethics. So we begin with James Laidlaw's piece for an anthropology of ethics and freedom, one of the earlier pieces in this kind of emerging subfield of the anthropology of ethics from 2002. He starts off making two observations. One, anthropology hasn't produced a body of theoretical reflection on ethics. Now, it has on other things, as we'll see, kinship, politics, what have you. Other disciplines have produced a body of reflection on ethics. He doesn't find one in anthropology, and that's part of his motivation. He thinks that this is something anthropology is well suited to talk to, and so he wants to kind of get this going as a subfield within anthropology. And so that's part of his motivation for this piece then. The other thing that he says is that if we're going to talk about ethics at all within anthropology, we also have to be able to talk about human freedom and therefore how people exercise freedom in different social settings and cultural traditions. In his view then, without a discussion of freedom, you don't have a coherent way to talk about ethics in the first place. You're talking about something else. On the first point then, he notes that whereas anthropology has sustained debates on kinship, economy, politics, and a host of other things, it doesn't have anything similar for ethics. And that's why, he says, we don't find that there are anthropological schools of thought on ethics, and there aren't distinct theoretical orientations within anthropology toward ethics, the way you would find, say, in philosophy, where you would have schools like deontology, I'll get back to that in a moment, utilitarianism, which is just a different approach to ethics, or virtue ethics, which is one that we'll come back to a number of times through these first few readings. Things, Laidlaw thinks, don't actually get any better if we consider what Durkheim, who's one of the foundational figures for anthropology and sociology, has to say about morality. In Laidlaw's view, in Durkheim's view, the good is in essence the collective, or what the collective takes as good. What Durkheim offers, Laidlaw says, is Kant's notion of moral law, just without the notion of freedom that Kant maintains as an essential part of the moral law, or of morality. So, what is he talking about when he says this? Briefly, Kant offers a series of oppositions. There are two sorts of motives: motive from duty and the motive from inclination. So acting out of a sense of duty to a law versus acting out of our inclinations, our desires, our drives. Secondly, there are two sorts of imperatives: categorical and hypothetical. I'll get back to what those entail in just a moment. And there are two ways of determining the will: autonomy, which is when you give yourself your own law, versus heteronomy, which is when you act under the influence of a law that is given to you. So then the way that these fit together, duty, categorical imperative, and autonomy, they interknit and can be schematized in a particular way. So before I get to that though, duty is duty to a universalizable law. The categorical imperative, which in fact is what gives us the universalizable law, is in Kant's view a good in itself. It has no external defining purpose. If it had, then we wouldn't be following a categorical imperative. We would be following whatever that purpose is. And so that would be heteronomy, which brings us to the third part. Autonomy then. Autonomy is this principle of freedom by which you give yourself the law, and significantly, you apply your reason to arrive at the law. Okay, so now they can be interknit, I say, in a sort of a scheme. The scheme looks like this, so that you have motives, freedom or determination of will, and imperatives. For each of those, you have the two branches. Motives can be duty or inclination. Freedom can be autonomous or heteronomous, and imperatives can be categorical or hypothetical. So then, autonomy, you're giving yourself your own law. You're giving yourself that law through the categorical imperative. What does that entail? It means that whatever subjective principle you have, so the principle of action that you have for yourself, if you can universalize it so that it is a principle that you could wish everybody to follow, not just yourself, so then not a principle that is suited only for you and privileges you, gives you some advantage, but rather one that can be applied universally. A principle like, say, don't tell lies or speak truthfully, right? That these are imperatives that you could, in principle, apply uniformly to everyone, whereas a categorical or an imperative like give me money, you can see you can't universalize that. Not everybody could simultaneously hold that position and it remain coherent. It would have an internal contradiction. So then that's where you get the universalizable law. You arrive at that, though, through the process of reasoning whether the law can be universalizable. And that is why you have a duty, you act out of a duty to that law. Now, it could be that your inclinations line up perfectly with a categorical imperative. Like maybe you have an instrumental reason that suits you for always telling the truth. Kant thinks if you operate according to that inclination rather than out of a sense of duty to that law, then you are acting under heteronomy. You're acting under a law that your inclinations are giving to you, not a law that you are giving to yourself through your reason. And therefore, also, your action obeys a hypothetical imperative. A hypothetical imperative more or less has the structure if-then. If I want to get a good grade, then I should do all my homework. If I want to run in the park, then I should lace up my shoes. So that there's this kind of instrumental relationship between what you want to achieve and how you go about achieving it. The point there then also is that it gains its coherent from some purpose beyond itself. That's why it's if-then. If I want to do that, such and such, then I should do something else. It gains its purpose externally. The categorical imperative gains its rationale internally. It doesn't obey some other purpose. It is a good in and of itself. So then hopefully this is a very, very brief sketch of this, but hopefully you can see then how inclination, heteronomy, and hypothetical imperatives kind of line up together in one way, whereas categorical imperatives, the duty to the universal law, or if you are acting morally, you are acting out of a sense of duty, and then autonomy, giving yourself your own law, how those also form a fit with one another. So this is Kant's scheme of morality. Laidlaw then thinks that Durkheim offers duty without autonomy. So you get Kant's morality minus the freedom, minus the autonomy. Why? Because following a morality that is given to you by the collective, not by your reason, not by yourself, but by the collective, is to accept heteronomy rather than autonomy. And therefore it is to act unfreely. So in Laidlaw's view, what you get from Durkheim is a move that has persisted in anthropology toward a theory of unfreedom. How it is that we act unfreely because we are, in a sense, programmed by the collectivity of which we're a part, and that we obey the dictates of the collectivity rather than our own reason. Now, this is important for Laidlaw because it puts on the table two major schools of ethical thought and social thought, and he wants to set both of those aside. He wants to reject them. He thinks they are not sufficient for thinking about an anthropology of ethics. First, Kant's moral philosophy is at the heart of deontology, as I was saying. So what is deontology? It is a school of moral thinking deeply, deeply indebted to Kant that prioritizes duty to follow moral law, right? Again, if you are acting out of duty to the moral law, you are acting morally. If you are doing the same action motivated by inclination rather than duty, then you are not acting in a moral way in Kant's view. Second, the emphasis on rule following as central to morality appeals to Durkheim, as it does in its way to Kant. But where Kant thinks that our duty to moral law stems from practical reason, our application of reason autonomously, Durkheim thinks it comes from society. As with his argument, for example, that gods, so if gods are moral authorities for us, and if we are to in some way obey or adhere to the desires of gods, then, or at least take into account the desires of gods when we want to consider what moral action is, he thinks then that gods are simply the symbolic expression of society, so that we take our collective moral sensibilities, we abstract them into a notion of a deity, and then we project our moral notions onto that deity as if we're getting them from the deity rather than producing them for ourselves. So then Durkheim's defense of this position, it's a very powerful defense. It's made him probably the primary influence in sociology and anthropology on relations between social norms, morality, and social sanctions. Laidlaw thinks that these rule-based notions of morality, that they're just not up to the task of an ethnography or an ethnographic approach to ethics. They create more problems than they solve. His point then is that when anthropologists take morality to be identical with concepts like collective rules, collective beliefs, collective opinions, as we get with Durkheim, there's no distinctive conceptual work left over for morality and ethics to do. They just become subsumed by these other concepts, so that there's nothing distinctive then about ethics and morality. They're just another way of describing how we act unfreely according to collective rules, collective beliefs, and so forth. Laidlaw, though, goes on to explore how Durkheim, he resolved a vexing problem for Kant's moral philosophy. So then, for Durkheim, the integration of the individual into society explains how individual humans can simultaneously be natural and free and rational. But at the same time, then, Durkheim produced a picture of sociality that is almost mechanistic in principle, such that humans would just be the mechanical expression of the collectivity. He says, Laidlaw does, in this vision of human life, which simply lacks ethical complexity, dilemma, reasoning, decision, doubt, it is impossible to see how specifically ethical considerations might be distinguishable from other causal factors that make the bits of the system, the people, function as they do. So then we don't get an explanation of ethics, he thinks, from Durkheim. We get an explanation perhaps of something like how social forces work on us coercively to maintain conformity or something like that, but that's not the same thing as explaining ethics. Laidlaw's argument then is that we will not be able to pursue an anthropology of ethics without taking seriously the ethnographic description of possibilities for human freedom, right? If we can't act freely, if we can only act mechanistically, if we can only act unfreely, that is, in Kant's terms, heteronomously, then there's no discussion to be had about human freedom or ethics. All we can do then is talk about sort of the logical outcomes of a mechanistic system. So why would descriptions of agency, for example, not do as well for an anthropology of ethics? So an agent is an actor, right? Somebody who acts. So why wouldn't that do as good a job as a discussion of freedom? Well, he thinks agency or studies of agency focus on acts and actors that are important to the production, reproduction, or transformation of the structures within which people act. So we can say that there are social structures and social forces that act upon us, and then the way that agency enters the picture is to describe how it is that we act within, through, or against those structures. But then it relocates the focus back onto the structures themselves, how we reproduce them, how we produce them, how we transform them. He finds this dissatisfying. Why? Well, he thinks that questions of agency don't really attend to whether people's action is genuinely their own, right? That you can act under the influence of coercion and you're still acting. You're still an agent in that sense. But are you acting freely? Are you acting according to your own genuine motivation or propulsion or consideration or will, what have you, or not? Agency doesn't necessarily distinguish between those in a way that's satisfying for Laidlaw. So why is this? Well, it's because such accounts tend to recognize only the kinds of action that the analyst, him or herself, finds structurally significant. And so all these other things that are not structurally significant, that in Laidlaw's view might count as expressions of freedom, they're sort of marginalized, set off to the side, not open for discussion. He captures it like this. Put most crudely, we mark them down as agency when people's choices seem to us to be the right ones. In his view, then, we're kind of starting with the conclusion and working backwards to understand agency, rather than starting with people's actions, considering the degree of freedom that they have to act that way, and then building forward to an understanding of ethics from there. Okay, so if Kant is off the board, and Durkheim as well for Laidlaw, where does he turn? Well, he has some other influences that he draws on. The first is Friedrich Nietzsche. He's one of, and then one of the inheritors of Nietzsche's philosophy, Michel Foucault, who is a philosopher of history, and then also the American philosopher Bernard Williams, who is more or less a contemporary of Foucault. He thinks that these are more promising places to start to get a handle on what the anthropology of ethics might entail. He starts off with Nietzsche's emphasis on what Nietzsche calls the revaluation of values, that shows how not all values are moral values, so that you can have a kind of a universe of values, and within that universe, you'll have one part that is the purview of morality. But that leaves out all the rest of this universe of values. So then, what does he mean by that? The revaluation of values. So he picks up on the way that self-denying values, he'll come back to call these ascetic values in a moment, constitute morality. So that he thinks that there is an identity between self-denying values and morality, that's just what morality is. And it is that way to the exclusion of other kinds of value that are not self-denying. What does this mean then? It means the self-denying values mean valuing being, quote, meek, humble, poor in spirit, chaste, and unmoved by sexual passion, indifferent to pleasure, welcoming of pain and privation, and acting in ways which undermine their own strength or survival. These constitute a moral disposition, and one that Nietzsche characterizes as negative. They're built on negation, as seeing one's life as primarily a preparation for death. It's like a dress rehearsal for the life that comes after death. Why? Because that's where life becomes pure, valuable, after death. He finds this in more than one tradition, as we'll see. Now, following this line of thinking from Nietzsche, Williams distinguishes ethics from morality. Ethics speaks to this whole variety of ways of answering the question, how ought one to live? Morality, on the other hand, is a particular answer, just one answer or one kind of response. What is it? He says, the distinctive thing about morality, that should be thing, not think. Sorry about that. The distinctive thing about morality is that judgment is in terms only of obligations, and these can be outweighed only by other such obligations. What we get from morality in this view is an especially juridical framework. So very, in a sense, legalistic, punitive, judgment-oriented, organized around rules, rights, duties, commands, and blame. So then we can see how this fits with both Kant and Durkheim, and why, as sources for thinking about the ethical, they're limited to thinking only about morality, not ethics more broadly. And Laidlaw understands this as ethical system. I'm quoting him here. He says, ethical systems where self-denying values inform law-like obligations. That is morality in Laidlaw's view. And hopefully you can see then how he's drawing this from Bernard Williams. What does it mean, though, then, to say that there are values, ethical values even, that are not moral values? He turns to Nietzsche, and he points to the way that Nietzsche describes two different notions of good. Different and, in most senses, opposed to each other. They are mutually incompatible. So these break down like this. In the first notion, good refers to being superior, powerful, vital, capable, fortunate, beautiful, and so forth. Bad refers to being inferior, weak, inadequate, ugly, timid, ineffective, and so forth. So then these are value judgments. He wants to emphasize this. Nietzsche emphasizes this, Laidlaw emphasizes this. These are value judgments, but they don't think that these are qualities that someone possesses either as rewards, say rewards from the gods, or as the product of blame. So that they're not, in a sense, something that has been either bestowed upon you or foisted upon you as reward or blame. The other view, the moral view, where you get moral judgments imbued with questions of guilt, blame, and obligation, think almost in exactly the opposite terms. Here, good means meek, self-effacing, obedient. Think of the way that you would describe a pet dog. You would think that a dog that is obedient, self-effacing, that is meek with respect to you, that it's deferential to you, it does what you're told, it does what it's trained to do. That's a good dog, right? So these are the qualities that this notion of good entails. Evil is the counterpart in this view, and here evil refers to those who are powerful, dominant, self-assured, and so forth. Right? So then you can see these are contrasting in that the good in one is exactly the opposite in the other. It's either bad in the first set of value judgments, or the good of value judgments that are not moral become evil in moral judgments. This is what Nietzsche is pointing to, is that this first set of ideas of good get revalued to become evil in the second, in the moral judgments. So you get this revaluation of values. One value becomes, in a sense, its opposite. So then we have two value systems here, one that's a moral system, and the other that in which good flips either from being bad or evil, or standing in relation to bad or evil, and the good switches sides. Okay, so then what we get from Nietzsche here is that not all ethical systems are moral systems. Moral systems are a kind of ethical system, but there are other ethical systems that are not moral systems. And what appears to be, what appears in one way, in one ethical system, can have a completely different value, even the opposite value, in a moral system. And that the development of morality was not, therefore, inevitable. We had ethical systems without morality, in Nietzsche's view, before the emergence of morality or the birth of morality. And it was not given in advance that this revaluation of values toward morality would actually occur. And so to describe this, Nietzsche turns to Christianity and Judaism to show how these are contingent, not inevitable. They were contingent in their appearance, especially with respect to Christianity's ascetic moral values. So here we come back to this notion of self-denying asceticism. I guess those are synonymous in any case. So part of his project, Nietzsche's, is to free us from the idea that ascetic morality is the only kind of ethical value system. Right? This is a claim that morality is going to make for itself. It's going to say that this is the way to be ethical. There is no way to be ethical aside from adopting the principles of this moral system. Nietzsche then is pointing to the fact that no, ethical systems have existed outside of this, and that when morality or moral systems arrogate themselves to making this claim that they are the entirety of ethical behavior, ethical action, ethical principles, Nietzsche says, well, no, others have existed that are not moral in nature. So then, what does Laidlaw take from this? He says, insofar as Nietzsche's purpose then was to liberate us intellectually from the parochialism that equated a particular kind of value system with ethics as such, his thinking is an entirely appropriate starting point for an anthropological approach. From this starting point then, with Nietzsche and Bernard Williams, he shifts his attention to what is distinctive about ascetic values, noting that they do not just appear in Christianity, but also in Jainism, which is what his body of study has focused on throughout his academic career. Now, he gives a quick sketch of Jainism. It's a little bit more than I want to rehearse in this lecture, so I'll leave that to you to read in the piece itself. I'll just reiterate here that it has both lay and ascetic followers. So ascetic followers engaging in quite dramatic exercises of self-denial, and that they are, for the most part, supported by the lay followers. Jainism then entails a belief in reincarnation, a commitment to nonviolence, and the conviction that enlightenment arises through rigorous ascetic practices to avoid harming other creatures. So then he wants to think, how might Nietzsche help us understand Jain asceticism? Nietzsche again described the transvaluation of values as the reversal of the value of good, as I said earlier. Here, the noble notion of good, powerful, capable, and so forth, became displaced by a servile notion of good that recast the noble good, powerful, capable, and so forth, as evil. How did this occur? Through ressentiment. So Nietzsche uses the French term, even though he's a German language author, he uses the French term to capture what he's driving at. Why? Because ressentiment carries with it both the sense of an idea of re-feeling, a kind of responsive feeling, not an original or originating feeling, but a reactive, responsive one, and the idea of resentment. So we might be able to capture this through a notion like reactive resentment. That could be a way of anglicizing ressentiment. And so you get ressentiment as the priests of servile people articulated it for them. So this is the work that the ascetic priests do, in Nietzsche's view, in Judaism and Christianity. They articulate ressentiment as a positive value for, or at least a moral value for lay people to adopt. He says, Laidlaw, in place of the nonchalant and even pitying disdain of the nobles for their inferiors, the slaves regarded their superiors as dangerous enemies. So was born the concept of evil. What had been good characteristics were seen not just as a negative, not just in a negative light, but as the malevolent expression of unseen agency. So, where force, vitality, formidableness had been inseparable natural expressions of strength, now they were seen as if they had the choice of not being strong, as aggression. Correspondingly, being weak was also represented as if it were from choice, and therefore as an accomplishment. So you achieve weakness, you achieve meekness, you achieve humility. Weakness now becomes, in the new moral sense, good. This transvaluation built on a notion of guilt. So guilt is also a certain kind of transvaluation. It's an adaptation of the idea of debt, transfigured to become the driving force between self-denial. So now, how does this transformation take place? Well, guilt and debt are not exactly the same, so there is some transformation necessary to get one to become the other. Why? Because debt is calculable. It has an equivalent. You can pay it back. You borrow, you pay back, right? Guilt, on the other hand, is not quantifiable and therefore not fully payable, a characteristic that contributes to the development of bad conscience, right? This internalization of the idea that you owe a debt you can never pay back. That is guilt. Now imagine in turn that the way that debt becomes guilt is that one feels a debt to a god or to gods for existence, for your existence, for bestowing favors upon you, for giving you good fortune, whatever the case may be. But that the nature of this god is as one who confers unrepayable debt, right? You can never pay back adequately the debt that you owe for your good favor, the debt that you owe for your existence. In Nietzsche's view then, oh yes, and one other thing, this god or these gods also are uniquely positioned to stand in judgment of you. Now, in Nietzsche's view, this just is the Judeo-Christian God. The God that stands in judgment of you and to whom you hold a debt that you can never exhaust, that you can never fully pay back. Jainism does not then reproduce the Judeo-Christian genealogy that Laidlaw recounts coming from Nietzsche, but does have its own valuations of debt and ressentiment. So these concepts then are still helpful for thinking through Jain asceticism. Debt here, as with Buddhism and Hinduism, connects to karma. So then the suffering that you experience in your present life is the product of actions in your past. So, he says, ressentiment is redirected as an ascetic impulse against yourself. With Christianity and Jainism, each poses an ideal of human perfection that is a negation of actual human life. In your actual human life, you are sinful, you are unenlightened, you are guilty of committing certain kinds of, let's say, well, either sinful acts or acts that bring harm to others. And so it is only through self-denial that you can start to aspire toward this perfection that, the trick is only available after death. What Jainism does not share is the idea of indebtedness to God. Jain asceticism then is not a matter of obedience to God, but it is a matter of obedience to one's future self, so that you don't owe your debts to gods, you owe your debts to a future, more perfect, pure self. It is self-interest on a time frame constituted by future incarnations. So then again, you have this idea of deferral until after death. That is where you can achieve perfection. Not in this life. This life needs to be negated in pursuit of the purity and perfection that you can gain only after death. So then perhaps it is a debt to God you might become. So when the idea here would be that you become godlike when you achieve perfection at some future incarnation, when through asceticism you have purified yourself. So there might be something like a debt to a god, but it's not a God that's separable from you. It is the God that you could become. However you conceive it, though, there remains this idea of moral obligation. So Laidlaw makes the move from Nietzsche to Foucault next by proposing that Foucault gives us guidance on how we could anthropologically study the genealogy of morality, that is, the relation between morality and non-moral ethics, in a couple of ways. First, by paying attention to, quote, aspects of ethical life that cannot be captured in a history of moral codes or social rules. That is, if you were to restrict yourself only to what, say, Scripture told you was the set of laws that you must follow in order to achieve forgiveness after your death, say. He's saying that that's not going to get you where you need to go. So then what would it be? Self-fashioning to become a certain kind of person is, in Foucault's view, a practice of freedom. And for Laidlaw, an example of what we might pay attention to. So this notion that you act freely to fashion yourself into the kind of person that you want to become. That is a free act. It is an ethical act. We'll see in later readings that adheres very closely to ideas of virtue ethics, but for a later lecture. And so this gives us something as well, concrete, that we can look at as anthropologists. We can observe the kinds of practices people engage in self-fashioning, right? So that's not self-negation. It's not self-denial. It's not abnegation. It is self-fashioning. Foucault will also call it the care of the self. Secondly, from Foucault, we might study ethical freedom ethnographically by describing the ethical practices, or what Foucault calls techniques of the self, through which people exercise freedom in different ways and in different historical and indeed cultural circumstances. To put it concisely then, Foucault describes the pursuit of ethical projects to make oneself a certain kind of person. In these pursuits, you do not achieve freedom as you would, say, through aspiring to enlightenment, through asceticism, or aspiring to freedom of suffering as you would in Buddhism, or to everlasting life in heaven as you would with Christianity. In these pursuits, you don't achieve freedom in that way. You exercise freedom, given the extent to which you exercise choice or experience coercion. So then this is important here, right? Freedom is not the absence of coercion. Freedom is how you act within the context of freedom, of coercion, but that you can act freely in many circumstances, even though you are experiencing coercion, even though you are experiencing social pressure or social forces to act in a certain way. So that these, in Foucault's view, are not diametrically opposed. You can think of this in the sense that there may be a social force or a social agency exerting force on you, but that you can act in resistance to those forces. So that you're still acting within the context of those forces, but there's room for freedom in your action in response to that. So it's not absolute freedom or nothing. It's not absolute freedom or absolute domination, absolute freedom or complete unfreedom, to put it another way, but rather that even in contexts of social forces and social coercion, you can still think of freedom within people, the way that people will act. This approach then does not consider free acts only as those that conform to reason, as we would get with Kant, or are free of constraint or relations of power. Freedom then is something that you exercise within relations of power, not independently of relations of power. That's why the idea of resistance, it remains an important one. Instead, we exercise freedom through or in relation to definite historically produced modes, models and practices. We could consider, it's not a perfect analogy, as very few are, but we could think of this in comparison to language. We utter sentences of our own making. We can produce sentences freely, even though we can only do that on the basis of a language that we haven't invented by ourselves or for ourselves. It's an inherited language. If we are to produce sentences, we have to do it with respect to the grammar of that language. We have to employ the vocabulary that that language provides. These are the very possibilities of speaking at all. So that you can see, I hope anyway, if the analogy holds, that even though you're speaking within, or writing within, the constraints of grammar, that you still exercise a kind of freedom to express yourself using the vocabulary that everybody else shares. And then the idea of constraint and freedom are not strictly exclusive to one another. Laidlaw characterizes the freedom of the ethical subject, in Foucault's view, as, quote, the possibility of choosing the kind of self one wishes to be, actively answering the ethical question of how or as what one ought to live, is to exercise this self-constituting freedom. What, as anthropologists, would we look for if we followed Laidlaw's and Foucault's guidance? Laidlaw offers a general sense of what it involves. Quote, by describing the different techniques of the self, one can tell the story of different ways in which people have purposefully made themselves into certain kinds of persons, and therefore of the historically specific and definite forms that ethical freedom has taken. Ethnographically, this involves developing an ear for how people describe these projects for themselves and for others, and an eye for recognizing these practices when people undertake them. So for our purposes, we can think of how it is that people go about reconstructing their lives in the wake, in the midst of, but hopefully also soon, in the wake of a pandemic, in some respects as exercising this kind of ethical freedom, trying within the specific circumstances in which they find themselves, which we find ourselves, how is it that people undertake certain kinds of practices to try to create the kind of life and try to become the kinds of people they wish to be, even given all the constraints that we face? How does that kind of reconstruction take place? How do people do it? Laidlaw points out as some examples that techniques of the self in Christianity have centered on affirming the truth of a scripturally revealed God, and on discovering the truth of yourself. For example, in what ways you are a sinner. In Buddhism, they involve practices organized to reveal that the self is an illusion. So Buddhism and Christianity are going to be at loggerheads there. Same thing with Jainism. Jainism is going to be in opposition to Buddhism there, because Jainism also holds to the idea that there is a self that gets reincarnated, and a future self to which your current self has a continuous relationship and owes this kind of debt. So Jainism shares in its own way practices of renunciation of the self that Christianity also has in its way, with its practices, of course, as well as comparable affirmation of the truth of Scripture. So then, even though the contents of Scripture are different in Jainism and Christianity, they share this kind of dispositional attitude toward the truth of Scripture. In different ways, morality arises as the renunciation of the self, and we can chart the specific principles and practices through which renunciation occurs in each case. For example, in confessional practices in Christianity, in fasting practices in Jainism. So they're different, but they're still comparable, because we can identify them both as practices of self-renunciation. Though these practices seek self-renunciation, especially the ascetic practices, we can also see how they are voluntary ethical projects, right? You can engage in them absent coercion. There's no sort of Durkheimian overarching social pressure, what he calls social facts, to compel you to adopt this kind of asceticism. You can do it voluntarily. They don't start from morality, they strive for it. We do not, therefore, find them in codified rules, but in people's actual practice. So that would be the ethnographic project then, is to chart how, not how scripture depicts the way that you should act, but what do people actually do? So then Laidlaw concludes with these thoughts. He says, wherever and insofar as people's conduct is shaped by attempts to make of themselves a certain kind of person, because it is as such a person that, on reflection, they think they ought to live, to that extent, their conduct is ethical and free. And to the extent that they do so with reference to ideals, values, models, practices, relationships, and institutions that are amenable to ethnographic study, to that extent their conduct becomes the subject matter for an anthropology of ethics. So this is then Laidlaw setting out what an ethnographic project for a developing subfield, an anthropology of ethics, what it might look like, how we might engage in it, and the sort of theoretical moves that he finds valuable in building this coherent picture. So in the next piece by Cheryl Mattingly, we'll see another approach that, or another response to this idea of how do we develop an anthropology of ethics, that also has an important discussion of Foucault and that engages in a longer, more explicit discussion of virtue ethics. Thank you.